The envelope came on a Wednesday, the kind of gray, indifferent day that made the city feel as if it were paused between breaths. Marin Hollis noticed it because everything about it was deliberate: thick cream stock, the edges deckled, a crimson wax seal impressed with a device she didn't recognize, 2 lines crossing like distant rails, and her name written in a hand that seemed to have been taught to slow down. She made tea and set the kettle on out of habit. Outside her small flat the world went about its ordinary dispassionate business. A bus sighed and retreated, a dog barked once and stopped, the shop 3 doors down put up a new sandwich board. Inside, her life moved in smaller, steadier circles, less dramatic, more reliable. Marin taught composition at a community college, grading student essays under the lamp at the same desk she had had for 7 years. Her social calendar fit on a postcard: one neighbor she called every Sunday, an aunt in a care home, a dentist appointment in late March. She liked it that way. Quiet suited her. She turned the envelope in her hands and felt a little absurdity that she was being moved by paper. On the other end of the table, Poppy, her narrow plain cat, watched the seal with mild disapproval, as if the wax might contain sardines. She slit the seal with a letter opener her mother had given her years before. The paper made a small, satisfying sound, the same sound as opening the first page of a book you've been meaning to read. Inside was a single sheet, folded, the ink dark and evenly weighted as if the words had been measured before they were set down. MS. Marin Hollis, we are instructed to inform you of the passing of Captain Thomas Hollis, late of Gallowmere Light. By the terms of his last will and testament, you are the sole beneficiary of his estate, including the property known as Gallowmere Lighthouse, its lands, and all appurtenances. You are requested to attend the offices of Barling Company in the coastal town of Dunmere on the 10th INST to receive formal notification and to discuss arrangements for transfer. A key will be provided on your arrival. Please note the decedent expressed a wish that the new possessor not remain in the lighthouse overnight for the first week. This is recorded in the will as a matter of personal request. We remain, respectfully, Barling Company, Solicitors. The words sat on the page like a hand laid down in the center of a table. Marin read them, then read them again, as if repetition might make them yield a rational explanation. Captain Thomas Hollis. Gallowmere Light. The names meant nothing, then everything. They unmoored a small fact: the Hollis name traced in coal smoke ink through parish registers, a blot here and there in the room of her family history she'd never expected to inhabit. She could have called the number at the bottom of the page. She could have sent a stiff, practical email. Instead she made more tea and sat with the letter like an unusual guest. The solicitor's caution, not remain in the lighthouse overnight for the first week, should have read as a practical legal note: delicate possessions, insurance, repairs. Instead it lodged in her like a splinter. Who leaves such a request tucked inside a will? Why warn the heir against staying in their new home? Marin thumbed the edges of the letter, noting the small things: the tilt of the G.S., the faint impression left by the pen where pressure had been applied. The key promised at the solicitor's office felt, in her imagination, like the beginning of something else, a threshold not merely of property but of story. An inheritance, she had always meant as a transfer of things: a house, money, titles. This one felt like a transfer of location in time. Captain Thomas Hollis. The sea. A lighthouse. Night. Fog. She was not, by temperament, a person who leapt. Her choices had characteristically been lateral, careful. Yet as evening leaned into her small kitchen, the idea took root. She called in sick the following Monday, no lie, no apologies, simply a message sent with a click, and booked a ticket to Dunmere. Booking felt audacious and utterly rational in the same heartbeat. She told herself this was an investigative trip: lawyers, papers, estate inventory. She told herself she would be back before the month's end. That night, she dreamt in salt. In the dream the lamp at the top of a jagged tower cut through fog like a knife. The beam did not sweep, but held, fixed as a stare. Beneath it, someone moved along a rocky shore, a small, thin figure with a seaman's gait. The figure turned once toward a window and raised an arm in a slow, polite salute. Marin woke with the taste of sea on her tongue, a real taste though she had never been within 20 miles of open ocean for years. Her flat, the next morning, felt like a preparation for departure. She folded shirts with excessive neatness, layered sensible sweaters into a bag, packed a notebook she had used for 17 months and never quite filled. She told Poppy, experimentally, "Stay," and was surprised when the cat obeyed. She left without telling anyone. There are small rebellions people stage against their own ordinary lives, phone calls not made, routines altered, and as the train bore her north, she felt both the thrill and the vertigo of such a small rebellion. The countryside slid past in the kind of soft succession that makes you think of memory. Fields, hedgerows, a line of ancient beech trees. At the station platform in Dunmere a tall man in a dark coat waited with a placard, "Barling CO." Marin had expected a woman in sensible shoes, perhaps a polite solicitor with a tabloid-friendly accent. Instead the man who introduced himself as Mr. Hargreaves had hands that suggested manual work and a voice that kept to low ranges. "Miss Hollis?" he asked. The name hung strange to both of them. He led her to a hired car with the windows salted by spray. As the vehicle left the small town, the world changed, not with a single gesture but with an accretion of small things. The air turned crisper with brine, gulls circled in slow eddies, the road took a higher posture and the land fell away toward a ribbon of gray. "You've been given quite a place," Hargreaves said softly, as if the words might frighten the cliffs themselves. He spoke like a man who had listened to too many others tell the same story, the house that waited, the light that would not be coaxed. "Captain Hollis," he added, "was a private man. He kept to himself. People around here don't speak ill, but they speak carefully." Marin took notes like a student. "Why would he leave it to me?" she asked. Hargreaves shrugged. "Family, in time," he said. "Blood's complicated. The will's particulars will make that clearer." He made his reasons clear, though. He left instructions. He hesitated, then said, "Only, you see if he left a warning." He didn't elaborate. They reached the cliff road as the sky began to bruise. Below, the sea at first looked like a sheet of pressed slate and then began to heave as if the water were made of a slow, living thing. The lighthouse rose from the cliff like an old tooth, whitewashed, with its paint peeling in long, attritional flakes. A narrow path wound up to the lantern room. Not far, broken cottages leaned into one another like people in a crowd. A small breakwater jutted out into the waves, black as ink. Hargreaves stopped the car and pointed. "There she is. Gallowmere." He didn't wait for Marin to say how it looked. He was careful with judgment, even the way he turned his body suggested it. She could see, from this distance, the little gallery that circled the lantern room where one could step out and be close enough to try to touch the wind. There were iron railings around the gallery, rusted like a bruise. Marin felt, inexplicably, as if she were approaching a place that had been expecting her. The idea was ridiculous and ancient at once, like superstition that had crept into the crevices of ordinary logic. She walked to the building and touched the stone. The cold felt honest. The air smelled of seaweed and a faint rotting sweetness beneath it, old ropes, the remembered iron of anchors. At the front door she paused. Up close the lighthouse was smaller than she'd imagined, squat and solemn. Someone had attempted to paint its door a brave blue at some point, the paint had surrendered in layers. Her hand found the key in the pocket the solicitor had produced, an old brass thing, heavy, teeth worn like the edges of a coin handled too often. It turned in the lock with a sound that belonged to another era, a long, satisfactory click, a sluice opening. The corridor beyond smelled of damp canvas and wax. The house was a museum of the men who had lived there, maps on the walls with ports circled in faded pencil, a captain's chair with a burn on the arm where a pipe had once been rested, shelves of books packed snug and labeled in an even hand. Some items seemed recently used, a mug on a side table still stained with the faint shadow of tea, a pipe near an ashtray, an oilskin coat hung by the back door. Marin followed the corridor to a small study. The desk held a single open notebook. If she had been a different person, she might have thought to leave it unopened, to treat it with a kind of reverence. Instead she sat and read. The handwriting was tight, economical, and surprisingly intimate. In one entry Captain Hollis wrote about fog that did not lift of its own will, and about a sound he could not name that returned like a tide. In another, more private note, he advised, directly, plainly, that whoever took the place should keep the lamp lit some nights and not be in the house on others. There was an oddness to his tone. He wrote as if repeating a ritual rather than an opinion. When she looked up, Hargreaves was standing in the doorway, his silhouette a calm interruption. "There's more to read," he said. "But the formalities are for the solicitor. Barling will be at the inn tonight for the reading." Marin folded the notebook closed. The words, "Will's request, warning against overnights," reverberated in her like a covert rhythm. In the study window beyond, the sea drew its slow, unhurried breath, and the light that would one day dominate the cliff sat, inert, waiting for its keeper. She had come because a letter had said her name, and because, in a life of small certainties, an uninvited change felt like a test. As dusk narrowed, and the gulls began their lazy, melancholic circuits, Marin allowed herself one unguarded thought: the house was old, and with age came habits that sometimes resembled warnings. She had no idea what those habits would require. Outside, on the cliff, the first thread of fog rolled like a sleeper's breath. Inside, by the small lamp on the desk, she thought of calling her aunt, of canceling, of handing the key back and walking to the bus stop. She did not. She thought of the letter, and the precise, patient hand that had laid those instructions into her life, and she felt the smallest finger of resolve curl inside her chest. She would sleep that first night under a roof not yet fully her own, and in the morning she would meet the solicitor. For reasons she could not yet name, the thought steadied her. When the first bell of the village church struck the hour, the soft, hollow sound a long distance away, Marin felt the weight of the moment. She set the letter, folded and careful, into her notebook and slid it into the file in the desk. Whatever lay ahead, some part of her wanted to approach it like one more essay to be read: thesis, evidence, conclusion. Another part, older and quieter, suspected that this was a place that expected patience and not logic, ritual and not argument. The lighthouse hummed at the edge of hearing, the house breathing, the sea recounting its slow history, and the evening held its breath. She made a small, private promise: she would meet the stranger pages of the will with questions. She would not be foolish. She would keep the lamp lit where instructed. And if the house asked anything harder, she would learn the terms before she agreed. Outside, the fog thickened until the cliffs became a suggestion and the lighthouse's form blurred into the world's edge. In that soft, suffocating gray, Marin understood that she had been given more than property. She had been handed a place that had its own rhythms, its own rules, ancient, patient, and not politely open to negotiation. Marin left Dunmere early the next morning, the town still cloaked in a half-light that softened the edges of buildings and muted the colors of cobblestones slick with sea spray. The solicitor's office had been a simple affair, papers signed and read aloud with meticulous care, instructions repeated as though the words themselves might vanish if left to memory. A brass key had changed hands, heavy in her palm, and Hargreaves had offered a small, polite smile that didn't quite meet his eyes. He did not linger. He drove her toward the cliffs with quiet efficiency, leaving her alone with the sense that the land itself had been waiting. The road narrowed almost immediately. Ancient hedgerows pressed inward from either side, their knotted branches reaching as if to greet, or restrain, those who dared pass. The fog, already thin in the valley, thickened as the vehicle climbed. It moved like a liquid, curling in small eddies over the edges of the road, blotting the horizon into a pale, shifting gray. Marin could see only a few feet ahead, the beam of the car's headlights absorbed by the mist before it could reach any solid object. She noticed small things in the fog that unsettled her: a tree whose roots seemed to coil above the ground like sleeping serpents, a stray fence post leaning at an impossible angle, the whisper of a stone wall that was no longer there when she blinked. Each glimpse, each hesitation of her eyes, left her wondering if the landscape itself was alive, breathing in and out with the tide of fog and wind. Her thoughts drifted, as they often did, toward the lighthouse she would soon call home. She imagined it standing atop the cliffs, a solitary sentinel, its walls steeped in the memory of storms, salt, and solitude. The longer the road wound, the more her mind furnished the house with personality, stoic, proud, and patient. It was the kind of building that did not merely exist, but waited. The car slowed as the cliffs came into view. Jagged rock jutted into the ocean, black against the gray tide, waves shattering against them with a muted, relentless roar. The wind picked up, curling through the narrow road and causing the car to shudder as if the cliffs themselves were testing the vehicle's worth. Marin tightened her grip on the door handle, feeling the weight of isolation settle in her chest. Here, there would be no neighbors checking in, no morning chatter to break the spell. The only witness to her arrival would be the sea, and whatever had lingered in the lighthouse before her. She tried to focus on the mundane, the sound of the tires against wet stone, the scent of brine, the small thrill of seeing her journey's end. But even these familiar markers of travel seemed strange in the fog. The cliff's edges appeared and disappeared in waves of mist. She imagined herself stepping off into the unknown with only a thin strip of road beneath her. Shadows flitted along the periphery of vision, perhaps birds, perhaps not, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see a figure following her. The final turn brought the lighthouse into full, looming view. The building, taller and more commanding than she had imagined, rose from the cliff like a monument erected for some forgotten god. Its white walls were streaked with age and salt, paint flaking like pale, brittle skin. The spiral staircase inside could be glimpsed faintly through the lantern room's windows, though it looked as if it had not been climbed in decades. Rusted railings encircled the gallery, and below, the jagged rocks pressed against the sea with a savage persistence. The wind here was colder, more insistent, almost sentient. Maren exited the car, the gravel crunching beneath her boots like a signal to the house that she had arrived. She took the key from her pocket and felt its weight, a small, tangible connection to a past she did not know and a future she could not yet imagine. The fog swirled around her legs as if reluctant to let her approach, curling through the open space between the cliffs and the lighthouse. Every inhale was tinged with salt and something more faint but pungent, like wet stone or decayed timber. She paused at the threshold, hand on the brass handle. The building seemed to exhale, the draft sweeping through the doorway, tugging at her hair and clothes. The wind carried a faint sound, an echo, a sigh, the scrape of wood somewhere deep inside. Maren shook herself, blaming nerves and imagination, and stepped inside. The smell of old wood, oil lamps, and brine immediately enveloped her, grounding her in the reality of the lighthouse even as the fog outside seemed to press its gray fingers against the windows. The interior was a maze of narrow corridors, spiral staircases, and low ceilings, each lined with shelves of books, charts, and nautical instruments. Dust motes floated in shafts of light that managed to pierce the fog through the high windows. Every creak of floorboard beneath her feet sounded disproportionately loud, echoing as if amplified by the centuries of silence within these walls. She moved from room to room, cataloging furniture and curiosities. A captain's chair sat near the fireplace, its armrest worn smooth by repeated use. Oil lamps, extinguished but neatly arranged, suggested ritualized care. Maps lined the walls, edges curling with age, ports circled in careful, faded pencil. A small journal lay open on a table, its pages yellowed and curling. Maren ran her fingers over the handwriting, noting meticulous detail and the repetition of certain phrases. The light watches. The fog listens. As evening approached, she climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room. The view was obscured by the thick fog, but she could make out the violent pulse of waves against the cliffs below. A single, small lantern had been left behind, its wick trimmed and ready. She felt an irrational anticipation as she lifted it, noting how the glass refracted the dimming light. The fog outside seemed to recoil slightly as if waiting, silently, for her to make the first move. She descended before nightfall, noting each sound with a heightened sensitivity. The house was alive in ways she could not yet define. Each floorboard, each draft of wind through cracked windowpane, hinted at rhythms she could not yet hear. Her uncle's instructions echoed in her mind, do not remain overnight for the first week. And yet, even as she moved cautiously, a part of her wanted to see what waited in the dark corners of the house, in the lantern room above, and on the cliffs below where the fog met the waves. By the time she finally sat in the main parlor, the first stars were beginning to pierce the fog, pale and distant. The lighthouse hummed faintly with a presence of its own. Maren understood, deep down, that the journey had been more than the road she traveled. It was an initiation. And what she had stepped into was older than her letters, older than the town, older even than her own family name. Somewhere, in the thickness of the fog, the house and the cliffs waited. And when the wind carried a faint whisper through the cracks of the lighthouse, Maren realized that she was being heard. She did not yet know by whom, or what. Maren had spent the better part of the morning walking around the exterior of the lighthouse, key heavy in her pocket, a strange mixture of anticipation and unease thrumming in her chest. From a distance, the building had seemed formidable yet distant, a solitary sentinel against the gray expanse of sea and sky. Now, standing at its base, she saw details she hadn't noticed from the car, the way the paint flaked unevenly from the walls, exposing a network of cracks that reminded her of delicate veins, the sharp angles of the stone foundation, worn smooth by decades of wind and salt, and the gallery of windows circling the lantern room, opaque with the residue of countless storms. She circled the lighthouse slowly, boots crunching on the gravel path that wound around the cliff edge. The fog, thick and unyielding, clung to her shoulders like a damp cloak. From the upper balcony, she imagined the light cutting through this fog, sweeping across the jagged cliffs and turbulent waves, a disciplined eye scanning the endless gray. The thought sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. It was not fear exactly, but a heightened awareness that this place was alive in ways she could not yet measure. The front door loomed, tall and made of weathered oak, its brass handle oxidized yet polished in patches where hands had passed countless times. Marin inserted the key. It turned with a reluctant groan, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the thickness of the fog. As the door swung open, a draft greeted her, carrying the scent of salt, damp wood, and something faintly metallic, like old coins hidden in the walls. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The click of the lock sounded unnaturally loud in the silent interior. Inside, the lighthouse felt smaller and taller at once. Narrow corridors stretched upward in spirals, lined with worn wooden steps and low ceilings. Dust floated in the stray shafts of light from the high windows, which revealed shelves of books, charts, and navigational instruments. The smell of oil, wax, and aged wood was pervasive. Every step echoed against the walls, and Marin felt the building's history pressing against her senses, thick and tangible. She began exploring systematically. The first room, a small study to the right of the entrance, contained a captain's desk, its surface cluttered with maps, compasses, and a leather-bound logbook. She ran her fingers over the worn edges of the maps, noting ports circled in faded pencil and notes in handwriting meticulous and deliberate. One entry in the logbook caught her eye: the fog listens. It moves where it wills, and the light must guide. Marin's pulse quickened. The words were innocuous at first glance, almost poetic, but there was a rhythm to them that suggested urgency, or warning. Moving to the parlor, she noted the furniture's careful arrangement. Chairs were pulled neatly around a low table, books stacked in towers with precision, and oil lamps placed as if anticipating nightly use. The fire in the hearth was cold, but the ashes suggested a flame had been maintained here not long ago. Marin touched the arm of a captain's chair near the fireplace. The wood was smooth from years of use, shaped by hands she would never meet. It was intimate in a way that made her stomach tighten. Every room revealed traces of her uncle's life. A coat hung on a peg, leather-weathered but supple. A pair of boots sat neatly at the edge of a rug, toes pointing toward the door as though prepared for immediate departure. Journals and letters lay in careful stacks, though most were yellowed and brittle. Some pages contained precise accounts of daily routines, while others hinted at an obsession with the fog, the sea, and the light. She could feel the rhythm of his life in the house, almost like a heartbeat vibrating through the floors. Marin climbed the spiral staircase leading to the upper floors, each step creaking under her weight. The stairs wound upward tightly, forcing her to move slowly, deliberately, as though the building itself demanded patience. Along the walls, she noticed small, almost imperceptible carvings, initials, dates, symbols, that marked the passage of time and perhaps a silent claim over the lighthouse by those who had walked here before her. On the landing, she found the entrance to the lantern room. The glass was grimy with age and fog, distorting the view outside into a swirling blur of gray. From here, she could see the cliffs more clearly, though the waves below remained hidden by mist. The air carried a damp chill that seeped through her sweater, and she shivered, feeling as if the lighthouse were inhaling around her, testing her presence, gauging her patience. Descending back to the main floor, she found a kitchen tucked into a narrow alcove. Copper pots hung from hooks, and a small stove was meticulously maintained, despite the years. On the table lay a folded apron and a handwritten note in her uncle's precise script: "Use what is needed. Do not linger where the light cannot see you." She placed it back carefully, unsure what was meant by "where the light cannot see you," but the phrasing suggested a vigilance she had yet to understand. By mid-afternoon, Marin had completed a thorough exploration of the accessible areas. She paused in the parlor, letting the quiet settle around her. The lighthouse hummed faintly, not a sound as much as a presence, the gentle thrum of history and wind and waves pressing in. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, curling around the building like a living thing. She realized she could no longer distinguish the boundaries between inside and out. The lighthouse and the cliffs and the sea were interwoven into a single, breathing entity. As evening approached, the first low rumble of waves against the rocks reached her ears. It was distant at first, then louder, a pulse that seemed to sync with her own heartbeat. The wind carried a smell of brine and something less definable, something metallic and old, like the faint echo of life once lived. Marin lit one of the oil lamps and moved slowly through the rooms, allowing the small glow to cast shadows along the walls, revealing corners she had not noticed before. She settled in a chair by a window facing the cliffs, notebook in hand. Thoughts of the solicitor, the letter, and the journey faded into a new awareness. She was here now, and the lighthouse was no longer just a building, it was a presence she would have to reckon with. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the horizon, and the waves began to chant their relentless rhythm. She felt the faintest impression of a gaze, not from a person, but from the house itself, waiting for her to understand that this inheritance was more than property, it was a responsibility, a bond, a summons. Marin did not know what that bond demanded yet, but as the shadows lengthened and the light in the lantern room remained unlit, she felt a quiet determination settle over her. She would stay, she would observe, and she would learn. The lighthouse had called her, and she had answered. Now, she had to understand what it meant to belong to the fog, the cliffs, and the light that never fully rested. Outside, the fog swirled more insistently, brushing against the windows, curling into the corners of rooms, and brushing her cheeks like the whisper of hands she could not see. Somewhere high above, the lantern room waited, patient and silent, as if holding its breath until she was ready to step into its glow. The first night in the lighthouse arrived not with calm, but with a brewing sense of anticipation, as if the house itself had been holding its breath all day, waiting for darkness to fall. Marin had eaten a simple supper, a small portion of bread, cheese, and a flask of warm tea she had brought with her, and then moved through the rooms, lighting the oil lamps with care, noting the shadows that stretched and recoiled along the walls. Outside, the fog thickened, pressing against the windows, and the faint sound of the waves against the cliffs rose and fell like a slow, relentless chant. By the time she ascended to the main bedroom, the first hints of wind had arrived, curling around the corners of the lighthouse, tugging at loose shutters and rattling panes that had long been ignored. Marin set her belongings down on a small oak table, her fingers brushing over the surfaces, feeling the history in the worn grooves and stains of centuries of use. She had expected a quiet night, perhaps one punctuated by distant calls of gulls or the sighing of the sea. Instead, a sense of alertness took root, a subtle tension, like the small hum of electricity before a storm. As darkness fully claimed the room, the wind grew stronger. It clawed at the edges of the windows, sending a low moan through the walls, an almost musical resonance that vibrated in the floorboards. Marin drew the curtains closed, but the sound penetrated, reaching into the corners and filling the room with its low, persistent timbre. Each gust caused a shiver to run through her spine, and she found herself listening not only to the wind, but to the building itself, to the floors and walls, to the subtle creaks that suggested a presence moving just beyond her line of sight. She had not been alone in this feeling for long when the first anomaly occurred. As she reached for her candle, a small, cold draft brushed her neck, rising from the floorboards beneath her feet. She froze, listening intently. The wind could not have found a path into this upper room, she reasoned. And yet, the sensation persisted, a chill, as if fingers had brushed her skin lightly, deliberately. Her pulse quickened, but she told herself it was the wind, the natural breath of the sea pressing against the lighthouse. Moments later came the sound, faint, deliberate footsteps above her bedroom. The floorboards groaned under a weight that was too precise to be the wind alone. Marin's gaze rose to the ceiling, eyes wide in the flickering light of the oil lamp. She told herself that the upper floor was supposed to be empty, sealed. There should be no movement, and yet the sound continued, soft, slow, deliberate, circling above her as if tracing the contours of a room she could not see. Heart hammering, she rose and tiptoed across the floor, tracing the source. Each creak of her own steps echoed unnaturally, almost as if the house were mimicking her movements. She pressed her ear against the ceiling, straining for any further indication of presence. There was only the soft scuff of distant footsteps, retreating and returning, forming a rhythm that seemed neither random nor accidental. Marin returned to her bed, pulling the covers tightly around her, yet she could not ignore the way the wind and the footsteps interacted, as if the house itself were alive, its breath synchronized with her own. Her thoughts, normally orderly and calm, began to fracture under the tension. She imagined shapes in the shadows, a figure lingering just beyond the doorway, a reflection in the small mirror on the dresser that had not existed a moment before, a hand brushing against the wall where no hand should be. The storm outside began in earnest then, waves slamming against the cliffs with thunderous persistence. Rain lashed against the windows, wind howled through the broken gaps in the masonry, and lightning cast fleeting, jagged illuminations across the room. Each flash revealed corners of the room previously hidden in shadow, the jagged edge of a bookcase, the uneven surface of the floor, the subtle glint of a metallic object in the far corner. In the intermittent darkness between flashes, she felt eyes upon her, though she could see no one. Then came the sound she could not explain, a soft, low humming, almost melodic, originating somewhere in the far reaches of the house. It was too deliberate to be the wind, too structured to be random. The vibration carried through the floor, resonating in her bones. Marin rose again, moving toward the sound, guided by a mixture of dread and curiosity. The hallway beyond her bedroom stretched into shadow, twisting in a way that seemed longer than the architecture suggested. She walked slowly, each step careful, listening as the hum receded slightly, then drew nearer as if teasing her forward. She stopped at the top of the spiral staircase leading down to the parlor. The humming was strongest there, weaving through the walls themselves. The hairs on her arms stood on end. She pressed a hand against the railing, feeling the vibration transfer through the wood into her palm. A part of her screamed to flee, to return to the relative safety of her bedroom, yet another part, the part that had accepted the inheritance, the key, and the promise of discovery, urged her to follow the sound, to confront it. From somewhere below, a floorboard creaked sharply, louder than it should have. Marin froze, ears straining. Then, faint but unmistakable, came a whisper, her name. Marin. The syllable was drawn out, delicate, almost tender, yet under it lay a layer of intent she could not place. She felt the hair on the back of her neck rise. The voice had come from the east wing, the part of the lighthouse she had been explicitly warned not to disturb. Her rational mind argued that it could not be, that the east wing was sealed, inaccessible, and certainly empty. Yet the whisper persisted, repeated once more, softly, as if coaxing her toward it. The storm outside increased, wind lashing rain against the windows, each gust pressing the fog against the glass like a living hand. Marin's breathing became shallow, her heartbeat quick. She tried to retreat, telling herself it was imagination, exhaustion, and the natural unease of a new place. Yet the floor beneath her feet thrummed in response to the whisper, vibrating as though the house itself were alive and guiding her steps. She returned to her bedroom finally, seeking the fragile safety of bed and the illusion of isolation. The lamp flickered, casting shadows that seemed to twist along the walls in patterns too complex to be coincidental. The footsteps above continued, now faint, sporadic, as if pacing in a rhythm designed to keep her awake. Marin lay down, pulling the blanket close, but sleep did not come. Instead, she listened, to the hum in the walls, to the wind tearing at the shutters, to the whisper calling her from the forbidden east wing. Hours passed. She drifted at intervals, her mind teetering on the edge of dreams and wakefulness. In the liminal space between consciousness, the lighthouse revealed itself as more than structure. It was guardian, observer, and perhaps even captor. The sound of the storm, the persistent hum, the teasing footsteps, all became threads woven into a tapestry she could not yet comprehend. By morning, Marin was exhausted, trembling, yet unbroken. The first night had tested her in ways the letter and key could not have forewarned. She understood, in a profound, unshakable way, that the inheritance she had received was more than property, it was a summons into a rhythm and history far beyond ordinary comprehension. The lighthouse had spoken, and she had listened. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the fog hanging low over the cliffs. The sea churned below with a subdued but relentless motion, and Marin, eyes heavy yet alert, realized that the east wing door still loomed in shadow, an invitation, and a warning. Something, someone, awaited her attention. And the lighthouse, patient and imperious, had begun its subtle work on her perception of reality. The morning after the storm, Marin felt a restless energy she could not shake. She moved through the lighthouse with heightened awareness, every creak of floorboard and gust of wind carrying a subtle weight, a silent insistence. Her eyes lingered on the corridor leading to the east wing, the part of the house that had been firmly barred from entry. The door was solid oak, reinforced with iron hinges that had grown dull with age, its brass handle gleaming faintly despite the patina of years. A small sign, worn almost to illegibility, read simply, "Do not enter." She stood before it, hand hovering over the cold metal. The first night's events, footsteps above her room, the whispering voice, the hum in the walls, echoed in her mind, compelling her curiosity. Her rational mind argued against it. The caretaker's warnings, repeated with a grave tone, rang in her ears. Some parts of the house were best left locked. And yet, the door seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it knew she was standing there, waiting. The caretaker, an old man named Gervis, appeared suddenly from the far end of the hall, his step silent despite the weight of his age. He was small, wiry, and stooped, with eyes that darted constantly, as if he expected danger to arrive at any moment. His voice, when he spoke, was low and tight, almost a whisper. "I wouldn't be near that door if I were you." Marin turned to face him, noting the unusual tension in his posture. His hands trembled slightly, gripping the railing beside him. "Why?" she asked, trying to keep her tone steady. "What's behind it?" Gervis's gaze flickered toward the door, and for a moment his lips pressed into a thin line. He swallowed audibly, then said, some things are not meant to be seen. That wing, people have tried. Few have lasted." His eyes, dark and wary, held hers. There was no anger, only fear. Marin's curiosity, far from being soothed, intensified. The day passed with a nervous rhythm. Marin moved from room to room, checking the bookshelves, the maps, the journals. She could feel the pull of the east wing at the edge of her consciousness, a subtle tug in the very air of the lighthouse. Every step she took seemed to resonate with the locked door, as if the house itself was aware of her attention. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the hallways, bending slightly toward the east wing, and the faint hum from the previous night seemed to linger in the corners of her mind, just beneath the threshold of perception. By mid-afternoon, she found herself once more before the door. The brass handle gleamed, cold and insistent. She pressed her palm against it, and for a moment, it seemed to shiver under her touch. A draft slipped beneath the crack at the bottom, carrying with it a faint, metallic scent, sharp and unmistakably alive. Marin's heartbeat accelerated. The door was not merely a barrier, it was a threshold, a sentinel standing between the ordinary and something beyond comprehension. Gervis returned, as if drawn by the same invisible force. His expression was a mixture of resignation and warning. "Do you feel it?" he asked quietly, his voice almost drowned by the wind that now howled outside the lighthouse. "The air, it changes near that door. The moment you cross the threshold, you step into something that has been waiting." Marin tilted her head, studying him. Waiting for what? His lips pressed together tightly. His gaze dropped to the floor, and when he finally spoke, it was almost inaudible, for someone to take their place. "The house, it binds. It chooses. And the east wing holds the last promise." Marin felt a chill creep up her spine, but instead of retreating, she was drawn closer. The allure of the unknown, of discovering what secrets lay hidden behind the forbidding door, was stronger than her fear. She studied the small scratches on the handle, the tiny grooves in the wood that suggested repeated attempts to open it. Perhaps others had tried and failed. Perhaps that failure had left an imprint, a memory in the very fibers of the door itself. Gervis stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I have served this house for decades," he said, "and I have seen its choices, its demands. I swear to you, child, some things are not meant for mortal eyes. The east wing, it is patient, but it is also relentless. It remembers every touch, every glance, every hesitation. And it watches those who approach it, weighing their resolve." Marin nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of his words. There was truth in his fear, and yet her resolve only hardened. The first night's storm had shown her that the lighthouse was alive in ways she could barely understand. If she were to inherit it fully, she would need to confront what lay beyond that door. And yet, Gervis's warnings left her with a lingering unease. Some thresholds, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. Hours passed. The wind outside intensified, carrying with it the smell of brine and decay, and the faint creaking of the east wing's hidden mechanisms whispered through the walls. Marin's thoughts drifted between rationality and anticipation. What could be so important, so dangerous, that it required a locked door and a lifetime of warnings? And why did the house itself seem to pulse with expectation whenever she neared it? As night fell, Marin retired to her bedroom, but the east wing door remained in her mind. Its presence loomed in every shadow, every gust of wind, every subtle vibration of the floorboards. The locked barrier was no longer merely a physical obstacle, it had become a symbol of the unknown, a living riddle calling her to test her courage. Gervais's voice echoed faintly in her memory, "It chooses, and it watches." The words haunted her as she lay beneath the blankets, listening to the hum that seemed to pulse faintly in the walls, a rhythm synchronized with her own heartbeat. Outside, the sea continued its endless chant, waves smashing against the cliffs with relentless determination, as if the lighthouse itself drew power from their motion. In the dead of night, the locked door seemed to sigh, a subtle exhalation that brushed against the walls and floor. Marin felt its awareness, its patience, and its silent demand. She realized that the east wing was more than a forbidden space, it was a test, a threshold that would define her place in the lighthouse, and perhaps in the history that had waited, patient and deliberate, for her arrival. The night stretched endlessly, and as she drifted into a fitful sleep, the locked door remained in her dreams, a monolith of shadow and expectation, whispering promises of revelation, danger, and transformation. The morning after her tense encounter with the east wing door, Marin awoke to a pale, muted light filtering through the fog-streaked windows of the lighthouse. Her body still carried the echoes of the first night, the storm's roar, the whispered footsteps above, and the subtle hum that seemed to linger in the walls. Even with the morning calm, she felt a tight knot of anticipation in her chest, a persistent reminder that the house held more than its physical structure suggested. The east wing loomed in her mind, a locked enigma, its secrets pressing against the boundaries of her curiosity. Determined to occupy herself and perhaps find a distraction from the growing obsession with the forbidden door, Marin decided to explore the lighthouse more thoroughly. She began in the library, a narrow room lined with tall shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. Dust floated in the shafts of light filtering through the grimy windows, and the scent of old paper, oil, and varnished wood filled her senses. The room was cluttered yet organized, as if each object had its proper place, each book and artifact accounted for with meticulous care. Her eyes caught something unusual, a small, faded leather journal tucked behind a row of oversized atlases. It appeared almost hidden, the type of object a careful guardian would place in a semi-conspicuous spot, neither entirely obvious nor completely inaccessible. She pulled it free, noting the weight of the leather in her hands and the careful stitching that had held it together through decades of handling. The cover was unmarked, save for a small embossed symbol she did not recognize, a twisted spiral, almost like a wave or a sigil, that seemed to writhe slightly in the flickering light. Opening the journal, Marin immediately sensed a presence in the words. The handwriting was precise, elegant, and deliberate, a careful script that conveyed intelligence and obsession in equal measure. The first entries were mundane, notes on the weather, observations of the sea, and the lighthouse's daily maintenance. Yet, even here, there were subtle hints of unease, comments about shadows in the corners of rooms, drafts that moved against the natural flow of air, and the occasional remark about a humming or whispering that no one else seemed to hear. As she read further, the entries grew increasingly cryptic and urgent. Her great-aunt, the journal's author, spoke of a family duty, a responsibility tied to the lighthouse and the surrounding cliffs. She wrote of rituals performed under the veil of night, of candles placed in precise patterns, and of incantations whispered to maintain balance in the house and to honor the presence that resided there. Each line seemed to hum with intent, vibrating faintly in the air as if the very walls absorbed and carried the written words. Marin felt a shiver crawl up her spine as she continued. One passage detailed the east wing specifically, warning that the room within held a presence older than the house itself, one that required careful attention and respect. Her great-aunt described objects that moved when unobserved, shadows that lingered longer than their source, and faint music that would rise from nowhere, calling those who were unprepared toward it. The tone was reverent yet fearful, conveying both obligation and dread. Her fingers traced the lines on the yellowed paper. She felt an almost tactile connection to the author, a sense of being drawn into the same careful awareness and vigilance that had consumed her great-aunt. The warnings were repeated in different forms throughout the journal, The East Wing was forbidden, but essential. The presence was patient, but demanding. The inheritance was not merely property, but a bond that required obedience and understanding. As she read, she became aware of the house around her. The hum in the walls, which she had thought faint and distant, seemed to grow subtly in resonance with her focus on the journal. The air felt denser, charged with anticipation, as if the lighthouse itself recognized her attention and responded to it. The wind outside carried faint whispers, unintelligible yet persistent, brushing against the windows and stirring the dust in soft eddies. Marin realized she was no longer alone in her curiosity. The house, the journal, and whatever presided in the East Wing were all converging upon her awareness. The journal also contained instructions, cryptic, ritualistic steps that were never fully explained, but which hinted at a process for communion or appeasement. Candles were to be arranged at precise angles, words spoken in soft tones, and the rhythm of breath synchronized with the pulse of the lighthouse itself. Failure, according to the journal, carried consequences. The house could become hostile, the presence within the East Wing impatient, and the inheritor's fate uncertain. Marin felt the weight of these words as a tangible presence pressing against her mind. The curiosity that had driven her to the lighthouse now bore a heavier responsibility, understanding and respecting the unseen forces that had guided her to this place. The journal was not merely a record, it was a map, a guide, and a warning, all written in the same careful hand that had tended the house and its secrets for decades. Hours passed as she read, the light shifting through the tall windows, fog curling outside and brushing the walls. She paused occasionally, glancing around the library, half expecting to see movement in the corners of her vision, shadows that were not quite shadows, figures that might have been reflections, or the shifting presence that the journal spoke of. The lighthouse seemed to breathe with her, and she could not ignore the sense that her exploration of the journal had awakened something, or at least drawn notice from the silent, patient presence she had inherited along with the house. By late afternoon, Marin had absorbed as much as she could from the journal, feeling both enlightened and unsettled. She replaced it carefully, ensuring it was visible yet slightly concealed, a balance she intuitively understood. The East Wing door called to her, the warnings of the caretaker and the journal intertwining in her mind. Entry was dangerous, necessary, and inevitable. As evening approached, Marin sat by a window overlooking the cliffs, the journal open on her lap but unread. The lighthouse was silent in a way that was not empty, it was aware, listening, measuring. Outside, the fog thickened over the sea, the waves hammering the rocks below in a relentless rhythm. She realized that the journal had not only revealed the past but had set the stage for the next chapter of her inheritance. The secrets of the East Wing, the house's presence, and her own role within it awaited her attention, and there would be no turning back once she crossed that threshold. With the first night fully behind her and the journal's knowledge pressing on her mind, Marin understood that the lighthouse was no ordinary home. It was a living, sentient keeper of history, ritual, and obligation. And now, armed with the awareness imparted by the journal, she was prepared, or at least as prepared as anyone could be, to face what awaited beyond the locked door of the East Wing. Night had fallen again over the lighthouse, a dense, suffocating darkness pressed against the thick fog that clung to the cliffs and spilled across the water like a living thing. Marin sat in the parlor, the journal resting open on the low table before her, notes carefully copied into her own handwriting. Candlelight flickered across the walls, casting shadows that writhed and shifted in ways she could not immediately explain. The air was heavy with salt and damp wood, carrying with it a sense of anticipation that she could feel in her chest, in the tense set of her shoulders, in the rhythm of her pulse. Her eyes were drawn to the grandfather clock at the far end of the room, a monumental piece of furniture that had been a silent observer of the lighthouse's history for decades. Its ornate carvings were worn with age, and its brass pendulum gleamed faintly in the candlelight, swinging with a solemn, hypnotic cadence. Marin had noticed the clock before, of course, but tonight it held her attention in a way it never had. Perhaps it was the stillness of the house, or the lingering hum in the walls, but the clock seemed to possess a presence of its own, as if it were aware of her, measuring her patience and testing her resolve. Hours passed with the rhythm of the clock dominating the room, each tick and swing of the pendulum resonating faintly in the floorboards beneath her feet. The hum in the walls seemed to synchronize subtly with the pendulum, a vibration that settled into her bones and echoed faintly in her chest. Then, without warning, the clock struck midnight, but the sound was not what she expected. It chimed once, twice, 12 times, and then a 13th strike reverberated through the lighthouse with a force that seemed to rattle the very air. Marin froze, candle trembling slightly in her hand. The 13th chime was impossible, an unnatural anomaly that defied logic and time. The pendulum's swing seemed to hesitate, as if caught between moments, and a draft swept through the room, curling around her and tugging at her hair and clothing. Her heart raced, and she felt a deep, inexplicable chill crawling up her spine. The lighthouse seemed to exhale in response, a subtle vibration that carried the hum in the walls to a crescendo, like a living thing recognizing the disturbance in its usual order. She moved cautiously toward the clock, each step echoing in the silent room. The air was thick, carrying a faint metallic scent, sharp and lingering, as though the very concept of time had been pierced and released something unseen. Marin pressed a hand against the cool wood of the grandfather clock, tracing the intricate carvings, feeling the history embedded in the grain, the rhythm of years measured in tick and swing, and now interrupted by the impossible 13th chime. From somewhere in the east wing, a faint sound responded, a whisper, almost melodic, tracing the edges of perception. The hum that had accompanied her since her arrival seemed to rise in pitch, intertwining with the resonance of the 13th strike. Marin realized that the lighthouse was not merely a building, not merely stone and wood, it was a sentinel attuned to cycles, to rhythm, to the unseen currents that ran through both structure and time. And tonight, the balance had shifted. The air seemed to thicken further as she continued to observe the clock. Shadows cast by the candlelight stretched and twisted unnaturally, elongating along the walls and across the floor. A faint vibration ran through the room, subtle yet insistent, synchronizing with the unnatural strike. Marin's pulse thrummed in time with it, creating an uneasy resonance between her body and the house. She became aware of a sensation she could neither name nor categorize, a presence aware of her awareness, a consciousness in the walls, in the pendulum, in the very air around her, acknowledging the 13th chime as a signal. The sensation intensified as the hours wore on. Time no longer seemed linear. Moments stretched, elongated, contracted in subtle, disorienting ways. The candle flickered erratically, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of the flame. The walls pulsed faintly, and the hum in the structure became almost musical, a minor key melody that teased at the edge of comprehension. Marin realized that the lighthouse was teaching her something, or perhaps testing her. The 13th chime had broken ordinary measures of time, revealing a layer of reality that she had never experienced before. She sat heavily in the parlor, breathing slowly, trying to steady herself against the tide of disorientation. Her thoughts drifted to the journal, to her great-aunt's warnings, to the east wing and its locked door. The lighthouse's awareness seemed to extend from the 13th chime, a thread connecting the clock, the walls, the hum, and the forbidden wing. The past, present, and something beyond, something older and more patient, were entwined, waiting for her to understand, waiting for her to act. A sudden shift occurred, the pendulum stopped briefly, suspended mid-swing. The candlelight flickered violently, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply, so that Marin could see her breath in the air. Then, as if responding to her presence and attention, the pendulum resumed its motion, smoother and more deliberate than before. The 13th strike had left a mark, not on the clock itself, but on the rhythm of the lighthouse, on the very fabric of its being. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a living entity, the sea's waves pounding the cliffs in a relentless rhythm, echoing the altered measure inside the house. Marin realized that the lighthouse had revealed a new dimension of itself, one that responded to time in ways both strange and purposeful. The 13th chime had not been a mere accident, it was a signal, a gateway, a summons. By dawn, Marin sat quietly in the parlor, eyes heavy but alert, hands resting on the journal. She understood that the lighthouse was not simply a house to inhabit, it was a living structure, patient, observant, and exacting. Time within its walls was flexible, responsive, and tied to the presence she had yet to fully confront in the east wing. The 13th strike had shown her the subtle, invisible threads of its power and expectation. She rose as the first pale light of morning filtered through the fog. Every step echoed softly, yet carried weight. The east wing door awaited, still locked, still forbidding. The lighthouse had spoken in its own language, through sound, shadow, and vibration, and Marin knew that the hour would come when she must answer its call. And when it did, the rhythm of the lighthouse, broken by the unnatural strike, would guide her into the next stage of her inheritance, deeper into the mystery and the presence that had been waiting for her since the day the key turned in her hand. Night settled heavily over the lighthouse, draping its weight across the fog-covered cliffs and over the restless sea below. Marin had spent the evening in quiet reflection, tracing the journal's cryptic instructions and recalling the unnatural 13th strike of the grandfather clock. The wind had softened, but a low, persistent hum remained in the walls, resonating faintly under her skin and vibrating through the floorboards as if the lighthouse itself were alive, aware, and subtly guiding her attention. She was alone, or at least she believed she was. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls of the parlor, dancing with the flickering candlelight, and every subtle creak of wood sounded like deliberate movement. Her heart thudded, both from anticipation and the lingering tension that had settled over her since the discovery of the journal. She had absorbed the knowledge it offered, yet it only deepened her sense of unease, revealing that there were layers of the lighthouse, and of the East Wing, that she had not yet begun to understand. Then, it began. At first, it was so faint that Marin questioned her own perception, a subtle whisper that seemed to drift from the direction of the locked East Wing. Marin. The voice was soft, almost tender, lilting with an otherworldly cadence. It carried a strange familiarity, though she had never heard it before. Her body froze in response, her senses acutely aware of every small movement, every subtle vibration in the floor and walls. The lighthouse, with its shifting shadows and humming resonance, seemed to pulse in response to the voice, aligning its rhythm with the slow, deliberate cadence of the whisper. The whisper grew slightly, weaving into the air like smoke, curling around the furniture, brushing against Marin's skin as though seeking to lead her somewhere. She moved cautiously, following the sound with a mixture of fear and irresistible curiosity. The candlelight in her hand flickered, elongating shadows into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for her, beckoning as if the house itself were aware of her every step. Each floorboard creaked beneath her weight, but in the deeper cadence of the house, the whisper seemed to guide her movements, moving just out of reach, teasing her forward. Marin paused at the base of the staircase leading toward the East Wing. The voice became clearer, more insistent, though never harsh or commanding. It was persuasive, a soft melodic lure that seemed to coax rather than demand. Marin, come, see. Each syllable reverberated through the walls and floorboards, weaving with the hum that had accompanied her since the storm. It was a presence that was patient, deliberate, and undeniably aware of her curiosity. The air shifted as she approached the threshold of the East Wing corridor. Shadows deepened unnaturally, curling along the walls as if alive, forming shapes that suggested movement where there was none. Marin could feel the temperature drop slightly, her breath forming delicate clouds in the faint candlelight. The voice drew her onward, just beyond the reach of her sight, making her aware of the forbidden nature of the space even as her resolve strengthened. The door itself seemed to react as she neared, the brass handle glinting faintly in the low light, subtly vibrating beneath her fingertips. The whispered call from within the East Wing intensified slightly, a cadence that seemed almost rhythmic, harmonizing with the hum that ran through the walls. Marin's mind raced with conflicting thoughts, the caretaker's warnings, the journal's cryptic entries, and her own growing compulsion to uncover what lay beyond. Every instinct told her to pause, to retreat, but something deeper, more primal, urged her forward. Her foot hovered over the threshold as the whisper repeated once more, Marin, come. It was neither threatening nor cruel, only patient and persistent. Her hand rested on the cold brass handle, and a subtle vibration ran up her arm, as if the door itself were alive, acknowledging her presence and silently weighing her resolve. The shadows shifted once more, elongating and bending, hinting at shapes just beyond comprehension. A sense of anticipation pressed against her chest, heavy and impossible to ignore. The hum in the walls rose in pitch and resonance, synchronizing with her heartbeat. Marin realized that the lighthouse was more than a structure, it was a sentient presence, aware of her actions and subtly coaxing her toward what had been forbidden for generations. The voice in the dark was not malevolent, it was a lure, a bridge between the ordinary world she had known and the mysterious, ancient rhythm that governed the East Wing. Every step she took along the corridor seemed measured, deliberate, guided by the invisible rhythm of the house. The candlelight flickered violently as shadows danced closer, elongating into forms that suggested movement within the walls themselves. Marin's pulse quickened. The East Wing was no longer just a locked space, it was a living threshold, aware of her, evaluating her, and inviting her to step across. Finally, she stood before the massive oak door, its surface worn by centuries of touch. The whisper flowed around her, a gentle, melodic coaxing that seemed to press against her very mind, Marin, come closer, see, understand. She pressed her palm against the door, feeling a subtle warmth and vibration beneath the wood, as though it were responding to her touch. The brass handle was cold but seemed to hum faintly, almost in harmony with the voice. In that moment, Marin understood the gravity of her inheritance. The East Wing was not merely a locked room, it was a sentient guardian of secrets, an observer of those who dared approach, and a test of patience, courage, and resolve. The whisper was not a threat, it was an invitation, a promise that what lay beyond the door would reveal truths both unimaginable and inevitable. As the candlelight flickered, shadows dancing wildly across the walls, Marin realized she could no longer hesitate. The voice had drawn her, the house had guided her, and the East Wing awaited. Beyond that door lay the culmination of her inheritance, the revelation of the lighthouse's secrets, and the first confrontation with the presence that had waited patiently for her arrival. She exhaled slowly, steadying her trembling hands, and let her fingers close firmly around the brass handle. The whisper softened, almost approving, as if acknowledging her decision. Marin's heart pounded as she prepared to take the first step into the unknown, aware that once the door opened, there would be no turning back. The lighthouse held its breath, the shadows poised like sentinels, and the voice in the dark lingered in the air, patient, guiding, and irresistible. On the 9th night, the house seemed almost too still, as if holding its breath. Then, just before midnight, the silence broke. The whispers began again, soft, urgent, and close enough to feel the breath against her ear. They came from the same spot in the hallway where the candlelight always dimmed, curling through the air like smoke. She strained to make out the words, but they overlapped in strange, half-formed syllables, repeating a rhythm that made her skin prickle. It was neither a language she recognized nor mere nonsense, it was like a chant, meant for someone who already knew the response. When she stepped forward, the sound receded, drawing her further down the corridor. By the time she reached the end, the whispers had moved above her, into the attic. She realized then that they weren't random, each night they were getting closer to her room. And if they reached her door, she feared they wouldn't be whispers anymore. The attic had always been a place she avoided, a cramped, dust-choked space where shadows clung to the slanted beams like cobwebs. But with the whispers now migrating above her head each night, she knew she had to see what was up there. The old pull-down ladder groaned as she climbed, the air growing colder with every rung. At first, it seemed empty, just boxes, broken furniture, and the stale scent of mildew. Then she noticed a narrow section of the floorboards, darker than the rest, as if something had seeped into the wood over years. Kneeling closer, she saw that the boards weren't nailed down at all, they were simply placed there, covering something. She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she slid one aside. Beneath lay a small hollow space lined with rotting fabric. Inside it rested a porcelain doll, its cracked face smeared with dirt, eyes wide and unblinking. The whispers surged louder now, filling the attic from every corner, as though she had finally found the thing they had been guiding her toward. The doll felt wrong in her hands, its weight was uneven, as if something small and solid was hidden inside its body. The porcelain was icy to the touch, colder than the attic air, and every time she blinked, she thought the glassy eyes had shifted ever so slightly to meet her gaze. She tried to put it back into the hollow, but her fingers refused to release it, as though the doll itself clung to her. That night, she set it on a shelf in her bedroom, hoping to forget about it. But when she woke, it wasn't there. Instead, it sat on her nightstand, tilted toward her, lips parted just enough to expose a sliver of black within its mouth. The whispers didn't come from the walls anymore, they came from the doll, soft and rhythmic, almost like a lullaby sung underwater. Her reflection in its glass eyes began to move independently, smiling when she did not. And by the third night, she realized the whispers weren't speaking nonsense. They were saying her name, over and over, as though calling her into the dark place inside the doll. The cracked mirror in the basement had been covered with a heavy, dust-choked sheet for as long as she could remember. When she finally pulled the cloth away, she expected her own reflection, tired eyes, messy hair, but instead saw herself standing in a different room entirely. The version of her in the glass was dressed in clothes she didn't own, and behind it, a faint flicker of candlelight revealed walls that were not her basement's. The reflection smiled first. It was a slow, deliberate expression, nothing like the startled look she wore. She tried to move, but the glass self stayed perfectly still, except for its eyes, which followed her no matter where she stood. When she reached to touch the mirror, the reflection's hand met hers halfway, warm, real, and impossibly soft. She yanked her arm back, but the other her didn't stop. It pressed its palm against the glass, leaving a dark, wet smear, as though the mirror remembered a touch from years ago. The longer she stared, the more she realized the reflection wasn't imitating her at all, it was waiting for her to match its movements, so it could finally switch places. At night, the house felt heavier, as if the air itself was pressing down. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, watching shadows crawl in patterns that didn't match the branches outside. One night, she noticed something strange, the faintest rise and fall in the plaster, as though the ceiling was breathing. At first, she convinced herself it was a trick of the light, the play of her own breath against the dim room. But when she held her breath, the movement continued, steady and deliberate, like the slow inhale and exhale of some massive sleeper just above her. The more she looked, the more she saw, tiny hairline cracks widening and closing in rhythm, and a damp warmth beginning to seep through the paint. Then came the sound, a deep, muffled heartbeat echoing faintly through the beams. She tried to move, but her body felt pinned to the bed, as though the air was suddenly thick and heavy. From the corner of her eye, she saw the bulge in the ceiling dip lower, stretching toward her, its pulse quickening. And when a crack split wide enough, something slick and pale began to push through. She always kept the curtains drawn at night, but lately, she had begun to feel as though something was waiting just beyond the glass. One evening, a sudden wind tore the curtains apart, and her eyes locked on the window. At first, it simply reflected her own face, pale, tired, and framed in the dim lamplight. But as she leaned closer, she noticed the reflection wasn't perfectly in sync. When she tilted her head, the image followed a heartbeat too late. Its eyes lingered on her longer than her own gaze should have allowed, and its lips twitched into a faint smile she hadn't made. She stepped back, heart pounding, but the reflection didn't. It stayed close to the glass, tilting its head in curiosity, as if studying her from the other side. Then its hand, her hand, rose and pressed against the window, palm flat. She hadn't moved. The glass fogged under its touch, forming words that faded as quickly as they appeared, "Let me in." She stumbled back, but the reflection's grin widened. The next time she blinked, the figure was gone, but the window was now pitch black, swallowing all light from the outside. And deep within that darkness, something shifted. At the very end of the corridor she had been too afraid to walk down for years, there stood a single wooden door, plain, unmarked, yet humming faintly with a low, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat. Every night, she heard it, a soft, deliberate knock that came exactly at midnight, never earlier, never later. No one else in the house seemed to hear it, and whenever she tried to ignore it, the knocking grew louder, more impatient, until her own pulse began to match its tempo. On the final night, the knocks didn't come. Instead, there was silence so heavy it felt alive. She found herself walking down the corridor without deciding to, her bare feet cold against the floorboards. The door seemed taller now, stretching toward the ceiling, the grain in the wood shifting like muscle beneath skin. Her hand rose to the knob, not because she wanted to, but because something behind the door willed it. The instant she touched the metal, a voice whispered on the other side, so close it felt like it was in her ear, "We've been waiting." The knob turned on its own, and as the door began to open, a light unlike anything she'd ever seen spilled out, too bright to be holy, too warm to be safe. It wrapped around her, and she realized with a sinking dread that the hallway was vanishing behind her. She wasn't stepping through the door. The door was pulling her in.